Permission, unanimous consent to address the Senate.
Without objection.
Mr. President, thank you very much. Late last week, we learned of the apology by the Internal Revenue Service official about the targeting of certain information and applications for 501c4 organizations in this country. And certainly the indication is that because of certain words, generally considered to suggest that that organization has conservative leanings, that those organizations were targeted for different or additional treatment at the Internal Revenue Service. And it was indicated that there was an apology offered, and this became a significant topic of conversation over the weekend by certainly elected officials, my colleagues here in the Senate, but by the American people as well. Last Wednesday, May the 8th, before this revelation was known, the Appropriations Subcommittee for Financial Services was holding its hearing, usually an annual affair, in which we were discussing the appropriations requests in the President's budget for the Treasury Department. And that gave me the opportunity to visit with Secretary Lew. And of course, the Internal Revenue Service is a component of the Treasury Department. And my conversation with Secretary Lew during that hearing dealt with a related topic. And while I find I have great objection to any group, liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat leaning, certainly the ability for us to examine an application is important, but none of us would expect or consider to be appropriate that the Internal Revenue Service would treat one application different from another based upon its apparent political leanings. And while that is terrible enough, I also want to point out the topic that I raised with the Secretary, the Treasury Secretary, Jack Lew, last Wednesday. And this comes from media reports and from complaints by organizations. And the reason that this seems so important is the admission that conservative groups were treated differently, or one group was treated differently than another within the Internal Revenue Service, lends credibility to press reports and to complaints by organizations across the country about their treatment by the IRS. And my questions to Secretary Lew, some of them that day, but also submitted in writing since then, deal with a number of instances in which it was reported by an organization or a press report that the Internal Revenue Service improperly disclosed information about donors to 501c4 organizations. Last April, the IRS apparently improperly disclosed Schedule B donor list on the Form 990 of an organization called National Organization for Marriage. It's a 501c4 group. And while the Form 990 is publicly available, tax laws and IRS regulations make clear that the Schedule B, that's the donor list on the 990, is not to be released for 501c3s or C4s. And so the issue was raised, the organization complained, it was reported in the press, and part of my inquiry to Secretary Lew is what has transpired since that point in time. Have the employees at the Internal Revenue Service who released this information, have they been challenged for their actions? Have they been admonished? Have they been treated appropriately for what clearly seems to be a inappropriate release of private taxpayer information? Second example was the IRS turned over several applications for nonprofit status, including the pending applications for tax-exempt status for a group, for several groups, and they were released, ended up in the hands of an organization called ProPublica. And again, while the applications for nonprofit status are available to the public after an exemption is granted, they are protected from tax return information as tax return information while that application is pending. And this organization then published that information despite what I understand to be a felony. Publishing unauthorized tax returns or return information is a felony punishable punishable, up to 5 years in prison or a fine up to $5,000 or both. And again, my question of the Treasury Secretary is, I've not been able to confirm that any action has been taken, any recommendation from the Treasury Department to the Justice Department that anybody be prosecuted for publishing private taxpayer information. Finally, we learned earlier this year that, again, something described as an inadvertent IRS disclosure related to releasing one page of the Schedule B showing donors to the Republican Governors Association. These are alarming in and of themselves and become more significant to me, having learned that there is a bias, a treatment different of one taxpayer over another at the IRS. And while it is important for us to determine, and I'm anxious to read the Inspector General's report as to the findings about what occurred with the singling out of certain organizations for a different kind of treatment at the IRS, I also think it's important for us to pursue the issue of the release of information that comes from one organization's filing that is inappropriate to release and ultimately being used by an organization that apparently has a different political perspective than the one whose application is pending. And so I would raise this issue that now that we know that something is wrong at the IRS, there is more to be discovered as we look at how did this information get released? Were people who released it punished? Was the publication of this, the individuals who published this information, is there any pending criminal action against them for the publication? Again, I'm surprised by the circumstance we find ourselves in. I would not have expected that the IRS, which must be, needs to be, has to be above the political fray. The IRS can never be an instrument of any political party, of any administration, of any political philosophy. All Americans have the right to assume that the Internal Revenue Service, which has great powers and great consequences upon the American people, upon the taxpayers of this country, is operating in a neutral, fair, and appropriate manner. And so the circumstances now present themselves in which we have to wonder about more, and the allegations, these three examples, perhaps being only three of many, but these three examples being ones that now are worthy of additional concern by members of the United States Senate, but more importantly by the IRS and by individuals within the administration responsible for the management and governance of the Internal Revenue Service and the Treasury Department. So I have submitted a series of questions to Secretary Lew. I look forward, as a member of the Appropriations Committee responsible for the Internal Revenue Service's appropriations, to see what those answers are and to make certain that appropriate action is taken in regard to individuals who apparently have violated the public trust, with the understanding that all of us expect the privacy that the Internal Revenue Service is to provide. So, Mr. President, I want to once again outline that while we learned something over the weekend that is very troublesome, there may be much more to this story that has yet been told, and I'm anxious to see the answers that come from the Treasury Department in regard to the Internal Revenue Service. I was pleased, and I would say, in fact, I would encourage members of the United States Senate, Republican, Democrat, whatever political leanings, Americans, all to reach the same conclusion, that regardless of political persuasion, regardless of philosophical bent, the idea that the Internal Revenue Service and its tremendous enforcement capabilities and its tremendous consequences that it has to the American people in decisions that it make always be above the political fray. And so, Mr. President, I thank you for the opportunity to be on the Senate floor today to outline an extended concern I have about actions at the Internal Revenue Service, and anxiously await for the Treasury Department to respond and provide answers to our subcommittee, to the committee, and to the full United States Senate. I yield the floor.